March 10, 1945. Just after midnight, the people of Tokyo looked up to see the sky glowing red. Above them, more than 300 B-29 Superfortresses roared in formation, their bomb bays crammed with canisters of napalm. As the first incendiaries fell, they burst open into flaming jelly that clung to rooftops, streets, and even human skin. Within minutes, entire neighborhoods were engulfed. Winds whipped the flames into a raging firestorm that boiled rivers, melted glass, and consumed everything in its path. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo lay in ruins. More than 90,000 civilians were dead, and over 1 million were left homeless. This was Operation Meetinghouse, a bombing program that killed more civilians than the atomic bombs. Planned by Generals Hap Arnold and Curtis LeMay, it was designed to bring Japan to its knees without an invasion. But the price of that strategy was the deadliest air raid in human history, a night remembered as flaming death over Tokyo. To understand how Tokyo became a firestorm, we need to step back to the man who dreamed of the plane that made it possible. General Henry Harley Hap Arnold was the son of a doctor from Pennsylvania, commissioned into the infantry in 1907, and one of the first men ever taught to fly by Orville Wright himself. By the time America entered World War II, Arnold had risen to command the Army Air Forces, and he carried with him an obsession to build bombers so large, so powerful, and so far-reaching that no enemy city would ever be safe. In the interwar years, as the Navy shifted from battleships to aircraft carriers, Arnold pushed his own service toward the future, the long-range strategic bomber. His instructions to engineers were blunt: make them the biggest, gun them the heaviest, and fly them the farthest. Out of that drive came a series of prototypes: the B-17 Flying Fortress, the enormous XB-15, and the giant XB-19. Each pushed boundaries, but each revealed painful flaws: engines that lacked power, airframes too unwieldy, and politicians ready to cancel projects after every crash or failure. But Arnold never backed down. He ordered that even failed prototypes like the XB-19 be built and tested, insisting that the lessons would pave the way to something greater. That something arrived in Boeing's B-29 Superfortress, a pressurized, heavily armed giant with the range to reach Japan and the payload to devastate it. Costing more than the Manhattan Project itself, plagued with bugs and breakdowns, the B-29 was Arnold's gamble, and it would become the very machine that carried out Operation Meetinghouse the night Tokyo burned. The B-29 Superfortress was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Massive, complex, and crammed with technology years ahead of its time. At maximum weight, it tipped the scales at 135,000 pounds, with a wingspan larger than any aircraft then flying. It carried 10 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, all controlled by computerized fire control systems. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to fly at 30,000 feet, while other bombers required oxygen masks, and it could haul 20,000 pounds of bombs across more than 3,000 miles. But all of that innovation came at a price. The plane guzzled 500 gallons of fuel an hour, straining supply chains. Its 4 Wright R-3350 engines overheated, caught fire, and failed without warning. Pilots joked the B-29 had as many bugs as the Smithsonian's insect department. Brand new aircraft rolled out of factories only to be flown straight to modification centers in Kansas, where mechanics spent weeks fixing electrical faults, cooling issues, and gun system failures. Yet, Hap Arnold refused to let the program die. He poured more resources into it than any other weapons project, more even than the atomic bomb. By mid-1944, enough of the massive bombers were ready for combat, and the first B-29 units arrived in India and China. The challenge was staggering. To bomb Japan, each combat mission required 6 additional supply flights over the deadly Himalayas, the hump. Crews battled monsoons, hail the size of eggs, and suffocating humidity that fried delicate instruments. Losses were heavy, results meager, and morale low. But the B-29 had finally entered the war, and soon, with new bases in the Mariana Islands, it would be unleashed directly against Tokyo. By late 1944, Hap Arnold knew he needed a new kind of leader for his new kind of bomber. That man was Major General Curtis Emerson LeMay. At just 38, LeMay was already infamous in the Air Force. In Europe, he had led brutal daylight raids over Regensburg and Schweinfurt missions, so dangerous that losses sometimes reached 1 in 4 crews. But LeMay was unshakable, calm, methodical, and utterly focused on results. Crews respected him, even feared him, because he asked nothing of them that he would not do himself. When he arrived in the Marianas to command the 21st Bomber Command, he found a force in chaos. Pilots struggled with the B-29's quirks. Formations scattered in the jet stream, and bombing accuracy was so poor that many missions barely scratched their target. The dream of precision bombing, the idea that the Norden bomb sight could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 30,000 feet, had been destroyed by Japanese weather, cloud cover, and violent winds. LeMay studied the problem and reached a stark conclusion. High-altitude precision bombing was failing. Japan's cities, built of wood and paper, were themselves the target. The answer was incendiaries napalm dropped in concentrated waves at low altitude, where accuracy and density could turn a city into a firestorm. It was a radical shift, one that meant stripping armor, reducing guns, and trusting speed and darkness for protection. Many of his men were horrified at the thought of going in low without most of their weapons. But LeMay was convinced. If the war were to end quickly, Tokyo would have to burn. The weapon that made Tokyo into a furnace wasn't an accident of war so much as a laboratory conclusion. Napalm, an incendiary gel developed by scientists like Louis Fieser and Hoyt Hotel, was still new, and the Army wanted to know exactly how it worked against the fragile fabrics of Japanese cities. So they built test towns. At Dugway Proving Ground outside Salt Lake City, engineers reconstructed a dozen Japanese-style homes, right down to tatami mats and paper screens. At Eglin Field, they built a model of Tokyo. Pilots dropped M69 napalm clusters and M47 and M52 incendiaries onto those mock neighborhoods again and again. The results were blunt and terrible. The small clustered incendiaries ignited roofs and interiors. Fires merged into larger conflagrations, and once a firestorm formed, nothing conventional could stop it. The tests also proved a tactical truth. Concentrated low-altitude waves of small incendiaries were more effective than scattered high-altitude strikes, followed by high explosives. Those findings reshaped planning. Hap Arnold's experiments at Eglin, combined with Dugway's simulations, told commanders that Tokyo's dense wooden neighborhoods were uniquely vulnerable. Commanders in the Marianas began to draw up a new kind of mission, one that would use Pathfinder aircraft to mark aiming points and then send in tightly timed bomber streams at low altitude to lay down concentrated incendiaries. The selected target was Shitamachi, a 4 by 3 mile swath of Tokyo, of narrow streets, paper walls, and small factories, precisely the kind of urban fabric that napalm could consume. But choosing a plan and making it work were two different things. There were tactical problems to solve, what altitudes to assign so wings wouldn't collide, how to defeat anti-aircraft batteries without heavy turret defenses, how to modify B-29s for maximum bomb load and maneuverability, and how many planes could be made airworthy at once. Mechanics worked around the clock to raise operational availability, an extraordinary effort that pushed mission availability from a routine 60% to about 83% for the impending raid. Pilots and bombardiers trained in the new maximum compression technique, short, tight intervals, visual aiming in the dark, and flying low enough to place incendiary clusters with deadly density. The plan was surgical in its cruelty. Pathfinders mark a central X, each wing attacks a sector of that X at staggered altitudes, and the wind does the rest. If the tests were right, fires would leap across streets, produce updrafts that fed the flames, and create a firestorm that conventional defenses could not extinguish. The blueprint for Operation Meetinghouse was complete and terrifyingly precise. Mechanics, navigators, and armorers worked like men possessed. For more than 36 hours, they tuned temperamental engines, repaired electrical gremlins, and loaded each B-29 with the deadly mix of M69 napalm clusters and M47 and M52 incendiaries. Where weight could be shaved, it was armor plates, spare ammunition, Even some gun turrets were stripped to squeeze in more bombs and increase range. The usual aircraft availability of about 60% was pushed to an extraordinary 83% for this mission. Every service crew knew what was riding on their hands. Brigadier General Thomas S. Power would lead the operation. 325 bombers stood ready from the 73rd, 313th, and 314th Bombardment Wings. Saipan-based planes, closer to Tokyo, carried up to 6.5 tons of incendiaries. Those coming from Guam, a longer run, carried slightly less. Pathfinder squadrons experienced crews trained to mark targets with incendiary tracers were briefed to fly ahead and paint the aiming points with X-shaped fires so the bomber stream could find the center in the dark. On board, crews checked bomb sites, oxygen, and charts. Weather briefers watched the forecast and noted the steady 30 mile-per-hour wind that would prove deadly for Tokyo. Radio operators scanned for Japanese transmissions. Picket boats and limited radar picked up only hints of the incoming armada. For many airmen, the tension was almost unbearable. Some were excited, some were fearful, and others simply resigned, steeled by training and the conviction that the raid might hasten the end of the war. Engines fired. The B-29s rolled and lifted into the humid night, silver bodies climbing into rows that would soon make history. As the formation threaded the Pacific, crews checked one last time, fuel, navigation, bomb loads, and steeled themselves for the run toward Tokyo. The mechanics who had turned out the fleet watched until the silhouettes vanished, knowing the sky above Japan would soon be lit in a way no human had ever seen. As the bomber stream neared Tokyo, the night air grew electric. The B-29s fell into their assigned altitude band's wings, separated by hundreds of feet, but close enough to pour bombs into the same neighborhoods. Pathfinder crews pushed ahead through darkness and haze, their job to light the way. They would ignite small, controlled fires in an X pattern to mark the center of the Shitamachi target so the main force could aim by sight. From 50 miles out, crews could already see the faint glow of the markers, small beacons in an otherwise black sky. The bomber commanders held their breath. Winds aloft were fickle thermal currents, and updrafts would buffet aircraft, sometimes throwing them hundreds of feet off course. Bombardiers gripped their sights and waited for the order. Then, minutes after midnight, the first M69 clusters fell. They did not explode with a single enormous blast. Instead, they burst open into dozens of small incendiary bomblets, globs of napalm that scattered, struck roofs, seeped under eaves, and ignited. The initial fires were localized, bright orange tongues licking at thatched dwellings, wooden shop fronts, warehouses, and the narrow alleys of Shitamachi. But the wind was a collaborator. It fed and carried embers, and embers began to land on the piles of household goods, on paper screens and tatami mats, materials that burned at an astonishing speed. As subsequent waves thundered in M47 and M52 incendiaries and more clusters, the small blazes merged. Smoke rose, thick and suffocating, and the Pathfinder X that had guided the raid was soon lost beneath a rising column of flame and ash. Bombers arriving later found their aiming points gone. Their crews could smell burning from inside the fuselage, and many had to pull on oxygen to steady themselves against the choking odor. On the ground, trained volunteer fire brigades and civilians attempted to fight the new kind of inferno, but these were not fires that water alone could tame. Napalm clung and burned at such a temperature and intensity that roofs and whole houses were engulfed within minutes. The tactics that had worked against conventional aerial incendiaries, bucket brigades, sand, simple fire breaks were suddenly useless against a wall of heat and consuming flame. Above, the B-29s continued their runs, each aircraft covering a strip of the city 2,000 feet long and 300 feet wide. The deliberate choreography Pathfinder, tight timing, staggered altitudes had been executed to plan. What began as controlled aiming points now became the heart of a spreading catastrophe, fires merging into a single unstoppable storm of heat and smoke. Within half an hour of the first bombs, Tokyo was no longer a city, it was a furnace. Winds gusting up to 30 miles per hour whipped thousands of small fires into one roaring wall of flame. Whole neighborhoods went up at once. Wooden homes, paper walls, bamboo frames all became instant fuel. The firestorm gathered so much force that it created its own weather system. Fiery updrafts pulled oxygen from the streets below, sucking people off their feet and feeding the flames higher. The Sumida River, long considered a refuge in air raids, betrayed those who sought safety. Water boiled as flames leapt across its surface, cooking people alive. Glass melted in windows, asphalt bubbled in the streets, and iron warped in the heat. Temperatures reached an estimated 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt metal and ignite clothes spontaneously. Civilians clawed toward parks, canals, and sewers, but most never escaped. Eyewitnesses described bombs falling like silver rain, each impact birthing a fresh explosion of fire. Father Gustav Bitter, a German priest in Tokyo, said it looked like a silver curtain falling. Where it touched the earth, red fires would spring up. Mothers carried children into rivers, only to drown in crushing crowds. Entire blocks vanished in minutes, replaced by rolling, devouring flame. In just one night, 16 square miles of the Japanese capital were erased. The inferno consumed more human lives than the nuclear strikes on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the deadliest air raid in history, flaming death in Tokyo. Tokyo was not undefended. The city's anti-aircraft division manned more than 600 guns, and nearly 200 night fighters were assigned to protect the capital. But LeMay's gamble to come in low, at night, and in tight streams neutralized most of that firepower. Searchlights stabbed the sky only after the city was already ablaze, and many gun crews abandoned their posts as flames closed in. Night fighters scrambled too late, some running out of fuel before they even found the bombers. Even so, the raid was not without cost. A dozen B-29s were lost, with 96 American airmen killed or missing. Dozens more aircraft returned, riddled with holes or crippled by engine failures, limping back across the Pacific and landing blackened with soot from the fires they had helped create. But compared to the destruction wrought below, the American losses were considered like just a fraction of the fleet that had taken off. On the ground, the defenses were overwhelmed. Fire brigades fought bravely, but they lacked modern equipment, and napalm was unlike anything they had ever faced. Out of 8,000 trained firefighters, more than 600 died that night, along with 500 civil guards. 96 fire engines were destroyed. Orders from authorities to fight, not run, condemned thousands to die in their homes, with buckets of water useless against a storm that devoured entire blocks in seconds. When the last B-29s turned for home, Brigadier General Power circled above Tokyo, watching the city dissolve into glowing ash. His map makers sketched districts already gone. For the Americans, the raid had proven the effectiveness of incendiary bombing beyond question. For the Japanese, it was the darkest night in their history. By dawn, Tokyo was unrecognizable. 16 square miles, an area larger than the entire city of Washington, D.C., had been burned to nothing but ash and twisted metal. Eyewitnesses who survived described streets littered with charred bodies, fire engines reduced to skeletons of steel, and whole districts where not a single building remained standing. Reporters called it a burned, empty prairie. The human cost was staggering. Estimates of the dead range from 90,000 to well over 100,000, with another 1 million left homeless in a single night. That death toll exceeded both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, making Operation Meetinghouse the most lethal air raid in history. Families had been incinerated in their homes, suffocated in bomb shelters, or drowned in boiling rivers. Survivors recalled the sickening stench of burning flesh hanging over the ruins for days. For Japan's leaders, the raid was both a shock and a grim warning. If one attack could erase such a vast part of the capital, what would happen when America turned its bombers against every major city? Yet Tokyo was not abandoned. Life continued among the ashes, while the military still urged resistance at all costs. In Washington and the Marianas, Generals Arnold and LeMay declared the operation a success. Arnold wired his subordinate, "This shows your crews have the guts for anything." LeMay, blunt as always, insisted it was the only way to save American lives. But for many who witnessed it, Operation Meetinghouse raised troubling questions about morality, strategy, and the true cost of victory. Tokyo was only the beginning. Just one day after Operation Meetinghouse, B-29s turned their sights on Nagoya, Japan's center of aircraft production. On March 11 to 12, incendiaries rained down again, this time gutting vast portions of the city. Days later, Kobe was hit, then Nagoya once more. Each raid destroyed more homes, factories, and lives, spreading the terror of fire across the home islands. Yet the Japanese quickly learned from Tokyo. Civilian casualties in subsequent raids were lower not because the bombs were less deadly, but because survivors knew what to expect. Families fled their homes at the first sound of engines, scattering into fields or canals before firestorms could trap them. Still, thousands perished, and industries essential to Japan's war effort were shattered. By late March, supplies of incendiaries temporarily ran out, forcing a pause. In April and May, LeMay's 21st Bomber Command focused on supporting the brutal ground battle at Okinawa. But once stockpiles were replenished, the campaign resumed with merciless intensity. On the night of May 25 to 26, another massive raid struck Tokyo, finishing what March had begun. Half the city was gone, 4 million people were homeless, and Japan's capital was reduced to a hollowed shell. One historian would later write that after Meetinghouse, Japan's fate was sealed. The firebombing had demonstrated that America could erase a city in hours. It was not a single weapon, but a relentless program of destruction, a program that killed more civilians than the atomic bombs themselves. For Hap Arnold and Curtis LeMay, the firebombing of Japan was not simply destruction for its own sake, it was a calculation. Both men believed that Japan's will to resist would only break when its cities lay in ashes. They argued that if fire could bring surrender, it would spare the hundreds of thousands of American lives that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would certainly cost. To them, Tokyo's burning streets were the price of avoiding a bloodbath on the beaches. LeMay himself was brutally candid about it. After the war, he admitted, no matter how you slice it, you're going to kill an awful lot of civilians, thousands and thousands. But if you don't destroy the Japanese industry, we're going to have to invade Japan. Do you want to kill Japanese, or would you rather have Americans killed? For him, the choice was clear. Yet even at the time, unease simmered among the crews who dropped the bombs. Many felt safer at high altitudes, reluctant to strip away their guns, and deeply troubled by the thought that their bombs were falling not on soldiers or factories, but on neighborhoods filled with families. Historians later compared Meetinghouse to Dresden, questioning whether these raids crossed the line between military necessity and terror. What cannot be denied is that the firebombing worked militarily. Japan's industrial output plummeted, its cities became hollowed shells, and by summer the nation teetered on collapse. But the moral weight of March 10, 1945 still lingers. Was it a ruthless necessity that shortened the war, or an act of devastation so great it stands as a crime against humanity? By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation on its knees. Dozens of its cities had been burned into hollowed shells. Tokyo, once a sprawling metropolis, was half destroyed and its people scattered into makeshift shelters. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama all had endured the same fate. B-29 raids rolled on relentlessly, shifting between firebombs and precision strikes when weather allowed. The campaign had proven that America could erase an urban center in a single night, and yet Japan's government still refused unconditional surrender. Behind the scenes, another weapon was nearing completion. Hap Arnold and Curtis LeMay both knew of the Manhattan Project, though secrecy kept details hidden. The atomic bomb was envisioned not as a replacement for firebombing, but as its ultimate extension, a single device capable of doing in seconds what hundreds of superfortresses did in hours. In June, Operation Meetinghouse and the raids that followed were reviewed by Allied commanders. 16 square miles of Tokyo gone, more than 100,000 killed, millions homeless. In the span of weeks, the raids had inflicted more destruction than years of conventional war in Europe. But the Japanese still fought on. The invasion of the home islands loomed, and with it, predictions of millions of casualties on both sides. Thus, the firestorm campaign merged into the atomic age. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August were new in design, but not in purpose. They followed the same logic LeMay had applied in March. Burn the cities, shatter the will, and end the war without setting foot on Japan's beaches. In that sense, the path to Hiroshima began not with the Enola Gay, but with the inferno over Tokyo. Operation Meetinghouse left scars that never healed. 16 square miles of Tokyo reduced to ash in a single night. More than 90,000 lives extinguished. Some historians argue the number was closer to 120,000 and over 1 million made homeless. By sheer numbers, it was the deadliest air raid ever carried out, surpassing both Dresden in Germany and the atomic strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For Japan, it was a moment of national trauma. Survivors spoke of the smell of burning flesh hanging over the city for days, of rivers clogged with bodies, of neighborhoods erased so completely that entire family lines vanished. For America, it was proof of concept. The B-29 Superfortress, Arnold's troubled and expensive dream, had fulfilled its promise. And for Curtis LeMay, it was vindication. His brutal doctrine of low-altitude incendiary raids had forced Japan closer to surrender. Yet the legacy is more than military. Operation Meetinghouse forced the world to confront new questions about the morality of strategic bombing. Was it a military necessity that saved lives by avoiding invasion? Or was it a war crime committed from the skies? The debate has never ended. What is certain is that on March 10, 1945, fire became a weapon of mass destruction, and Tokyo paid the price. On the morning of March 10, 1945, Tokyo was no longer the proud heart of Japan, but a wasteland of ash, smoke, and silence. In less than 3 hours, the US Army Air Forces had carried out the most destructive air raid in history, killing more civilians than the atomic bombs would months later. For Generals Hap Arnold and Curtis LeMay, Operation Meetinghouse proved the B-29's worth and validated their doctrine of firebombing. For the world, it raised a haunting question. Does the end ever justify the means when tens of thousands of civilians are sacrificed in a single night? The flames of Tokyo still echo as one of history's starkest reminders of the brutal cost of war. It was a mission planned with cold precision, executed with ruthless efficiency, and remembered with sorrow by those who survived it. A city turned into a furnace, a people scarred forever, and a lesson humanity continues to wrestle with. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And join us next time as we bring you more forgotten chapters of World War II history.